Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a pair of political crises puts Colombia's Gustavo Petro's presidency in the spotlight.
The dispute began over the weekend when Colombia's president refused to let two U.S. military planes with repatriated migrants on board land in his country.
Can the Colombian leaders stand up to the U.S. and make peace at home? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
You never know when you'll wake up one morning and then you'll see this huge feud on Twitter between President Gustavo Petro and another head of state. My name is Christina Noriega. I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm currently based in Bogota, Colombia.
So, Christina, speaking of a very busy news cycle, this has been a crazy few days for Colombia, and specifically for the country's left-wing president, Gustavo Petro. So first, there's the ongoing violence on Colombia's northern border with Venezuela.
The violence, some of the worst in years, began when the National Liberation Army, or ELN, launched a campaign against a dissident faction of former FARC rebels to control lucrative drug routes. The rebels have targeted demobilized fighters, community leaders, and civilians they see as opposing their operations.
Petro had declared a state of emergency, and we'll get to that in a second. But so while he's dealing with that, he gets into what you might call a social media shoving match with U.S. President Donald Trump over the treatment of Colombian citizens who are being deported from the U.S.
Donald Trump responded on his social media platform Truth Social, writing, "Emergency 25% tariffs on all goods coming into the United States. In 1 week, the 25% tariffs will be raised to 50%. Colombia's president fired right back. In his own post, Gustavo Petro said Colombia would impose tariffs of its own. Not 25%, but straight to 50%.
Can you just tell us how that whole story got started and how it played out?
Well, that happened over the weekend where, we woke up on Sunday and we found this series of tweets posted by President Gustavo Petro. And he had essentially decided to turn back these military planes who were coming from the United States with Colombians who are being deported back to their country. The problem lies in that President Petro had seen images posted by the United States of Brazilians being deported back to their home country, where the deportees were being handcuffed.
An emotional scene in Brazil after a long and miserable flight for a reported 80 people. This man says passengers like him were tied up with restraints on their waists and legs, treatment many there are condemning.
And he thought that as inhumane treatment. He thought that they were being treated as criminals instead of, migrants pursuing a dream in the United States. So as a protest to that, he decides he's turning back these two planes, and then that sets off this feud with President Donald Trump.
Okay, so how does Trump react?
He reacts with a very hardline approach. He seems to be wanting to make an example of Colombia and President Petro and trying to demonstrate American strength, and that if he doesn't get his way, he's going to use that strength to force other countries to cooperate. And in this case, he begins to slap tariffs on Colombia, saying that he's going to increase tariffs to 25%, then to 50% if President Petro doesn't budge.
Right. So this is right out of the Trump playbook. But Petro, for people who know him, he's no shrinking violet. So he fights back a little bit. He tweets, "You don't like our freedom? Fine. I don't shake hands with white enslavers." But eventually the power dynamics sort of manifested themselves, and he did have to sort of at least find an accommodation with Trump. How did he end up trying to resolve this?
Of course, originally we do see President Petro talking very proudly of the country, of the migrants who are being deported, speaking of the fact that they need to be treated with dignity. But in the end, we did see two flights coming in from the United States to Colombia on Colombian Air Force planes. And they were not handcuffed. President Petro did tweet this morning that they had been treated with dignity. And I think that does signal that at least President Petro was able to, make certain wins.
Right. Right. Okay. So the situation has resolved itself. Colombia's Air Force has brought a plane of deportees back from San Diego and another from El Paso. But in the who won the fight battle over narrative, it's kind of more about who you ask. I mean, we know where Trump is. Trump is putting out pictures of himself with AI-generated image in a fedora and a gangster kind of look with the words FAFO behind him, which means blank, blank, and find out. So he's depicting this as this epic victory. Is that how it's being viewed in Bogota?
Well, here I think that people do consider that Petro was correct in demanding dignity for Colombian deportees. Not everybody agrees with his methods, which was feuding with Donald Trump via social media. But they do consider that it was a victory, that now the deportees are not being handcuffed whenever they are sent back to Colombia. And I think it does bring up a broader question of what the long-term relationship will be between the U.S. and Colombia. Of course, there is this short-term victory for the United States and for Donald Trump and his methods of using sort of a maximum pressure strategy on Latin America to get his way. But, other analysts are finding that in the end, that may push Latin American leaders and countries to look for allies in other regions, such as China.
Yeah.
So I think in the end, it does beg the question of, what this is going to do for the U.S.-Latin American relationship.
So, Christina, this all comes while people are quite literally dying in the country's north. More than a dozen people have been killed since this weekend. And I think this signals that Petro's signature achievement, which he calls total peace, this cessation of violence and fighting on Colombia's long-running civil war is breaking down. So what is happening on the ground right now?
Well, what we're seeing is fighting break out between two armed groups in the northeast of Colombia, which borders Venezuela. And that has caused major chaos in the region. Thousands of people are being displaced to urban centers in order to escape from the violence. And what we've heard from the government is at least 40 people have been killed.
Can you give our listeners and viewers just a little bit of backstory, how we got to this point? I mean, this has been a long-running issue, why there are these rebel groups in the first place?
The ELN, which is also known as the National Liberation Army, one of the groups involved in the fighting now, can be traced back all the way to the 1960s. And essentially, they started as a rebel group trying to fight for more equality in Colombia, which has seen a lot of income inequality over the past decades. The problem now is that many of these rebel groups have become involved in drug trafficking. Now they're vying for these very lucrative drug trafficking routes in order to finance their groups and finance more fighting. The other group involved is a dissident group of the FARC, which had demobilized in 2016. In 2016, there was a major peace deal between the FARC, which was the largest rebel group in the country, and the government. But there were some factions of the FARC that decided they did not agree with the deal and decided to continue fighting anyway. And that's one of the groups that we're seeing fighting right now.
Right. And then Petro comes in 2022, and his big issue is to really hammer home this peace, to make it an enduring peace. What made it start to break down?
So whenever President Petro comes into power in 2022, what he's advocating for is something different from his predecessor, which is instead of fighting with these armed groups, let's try negotiating with them and create a deal similar to that was signed between the FARC and the Colombian government in 2016. And essentially, he promises that some of these peace deals, such as the one with the ELN, is going to be cemented within 3 months. But essentially, one of the major problems is that some of these groups don't have a hierarchical structure in the way that the FARC did, which means that there are some factions of these groups that are now not agreeing with these negotiations. And I would add that one of the weak points of this total peace strategy is that it didn't involve a policy for, negotiations or truces between armed groups. It essentially talked about negotiations between the government and armed groups. So what we're seeing now is that because there are so many different armed groups throughout the country, they're vying for these drug routes, which is obviously very lucrative. And we haven't been able to see the government take back control of those areas.
After the break, what Petro's leadership means to Colombia now. So, Christina, it appears we're at a real inflection point, right? Petro is Colombia's first left-wing president, and one of the reasons he is president is his backstory. He's from these left-wing groups that have been fighting for decades, like the ELN. He knows how serious this problem is. What is he doing to get the situation under control?
Since then, he has imposed emergency measures to bring this region back under state control. And he has sent the military to fight the ELN, the National Liberation Army. He's also been to the Catatumbo region. He was just there Monday, and he has been talking about bringing more investment into the region, which is also one of the reasons that conflict has constantly ravaged the region, is that it's not under state control. There aren't many resources for many of the impoverished communities, and many of them have resorted to drug trafficking and these armed groups as a means of survival. So he has continued, in a way, his total peace strategy, because within that strategy, there were calls for more social investment. But he is strengthening the military and trying to use the military as well to bring that area under control. In the beginning of Petro's presidency, he did talk about the National Liberation Army as, this rebel group with roots in the 1960s movement. And I think he's recognizing that many of these rebel groups, including the dissident FARC, are no longer fighting for ideological reasons, even though they insist they are, but rather they're simply fighting for control of drug trafficking routes, which are very lucrative for them. And, it does bring into question how Colombia is going to continue to handle counter-narcotics. Under the Petro presidency, he did advocate for an end to the war on drugs, an end to the United States, prohibitionist policy. So it is a question of how Colombia is going to handle this in the future.
Yeah, that's an issue all over the world. When paramilitary groups dissolve, they don't just stop what they're doing. They usually turn to other things that don't involve politics. Beyond just the political implications, the consequences of so many people being displaced and the possibility of that number, growing, that has the potential to destabilize not just Colombia, but the whole of the Americas. Does he see it like that? Are neighboring countries, are they concerned about what's happening in Colombia as well?
Well, this is a very critical region, not just for Colombia, but also for Venezuela. It's been known that for a very long time that the National Liberation Army also has presence in Venezuela. The ELN did use Venezuelan territory to move some of its troops to the Catatumbo region. So that has incremented tensions between the two countries, and it's sort of upending a little bit that relationship.
How's Petro doing politically? What's his standing at now approaching 3 years in office?
when he did first arrive into office, he was a pretty popular president. I think he was riding on this wave of discontent with previous administrations. And because he was the first leftist government, I think there was hope that he could implement the change that so many people wanted. But 3 years into his presidency, for example, that peace that he promised hasn't been able to materialize. And I think there are a lot of people who are very disillusioned with his policies, very disillusioned with his failure to keep his promises. And his popularity has plummeted significantly, down to around 36%.
Wow. Wow. So, I mean, Petro sees himself as this bulwark, fighting against a world which is creeping to the right, as a left-wing leader. From what you know about him, do you expect him to be emboldened by this recent face-off with Donald Trump?
Yes, definitely. I don't see this ending here with this deal between the government of the United States and Colombia over deportation flights. I'm assuming that Petro is going to continue in feuds, either on social media or through some sort of policy with Donald Trump, just because he has a very outspoken nature, and he has seen himself as a defender of leftist ideals in the world. So he has been in the past very outspoken against the United States and some of its policies, including policies toward Israel and Gaza. So I'm assuming that he's only going to become more bold during the rest of his presidency.
Yeah, he tweeted out, "Overthrow me, President, and the Americas and humanity will respond." That's the translation. All right, so I guess that I understand that this is emboldening him. This is right in his wheelhouse. He's a bombastic leader and wants to go face to face with Trump. But if his popularity keeps sinking at home, doesn't that undermine that case? I mean, do you think that this crisis on the border, this crisis with the ELN, is something that could undermine his case? I mean, could this be something that brings down his presidency if he doesn't manage it properly?
I definitely think so. I definitely think that some people here in Colombia are even criticizing that President Petro is far more concerned with what is happening with the deportation flights than what is happening within the borders, especially in the Catatumbo region. So what they're wanting from the government is for him to control the violence, to control the chaos, and also to, send a message to these armed groups that they can't continue to maintain these levels of violence. And I think that it is going to be critical for his presidency and for the left in general. The country is heading into presidential elections next year. So I think it might be a problem for the current government and for the left in general if they're not able to do something about the violence in the Catatumbo region.
Christina, thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you so much.
And that's The Take. Thank you for watching. We want to know what kind of stories you want to see more of, right? What corner of the world are you thinking about these days? What's worrying you or getting you excited? What news do you want the world to know more about? Well, tell us about it in the comments. We'll have a look and we'll let you know when that episode is up next. And we will be back tomorrow.